Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shlomit Steinberg, and I'm the curator of European art at the Israel Museum. And you're with me now at the Israel Museum Library, as you can see behind me. We are about to start a presentation about plagues in European art, mostly in the Western part. And what you will see is two parts of the presentation. The first, a little more pessimistic one, will show you the plagues themselves, the way they were spread across Europe, and we will try to keep them as chronological as possible. The second part, which will be much more optimistic, will show you the people who cured them: gods, saints, and doctors. So let's embark on this difficult journey. In the 17th century, after many years in which plagues distorted the life of European subjects, they decided that there is a way to describe it, but not the plague itself, not the sick people, not the dead ones, but to find an emblem, to find a symbol that when people will look at it, they will understand what is the cause of the plague. And thus, a man called Cesare Ripa, in his book Iconologia, which was compiled in the 16th century and reprinted during the 17 and 18 ones, created an image of a woman. The woman was old, she was covered in rags, and she stood within a cloud of black vapors. The black vapor was called miasma, and the idea behind it was that bad air that was very common in the cities of medieval times and after, was something that came from rotting vegetables, rotting corpses of animals, from unclean water, and caused plagues. In the back of the image, you can see King David being approached by an angel. The angel comes to say to King David that the plague that he himself caused by doing a census to the children of Israel is about to stop after 1,700 people have died. The Flemish 17th century painter Peter van Halen depicted the plague in Ashdod. Ashdod was a Philistine town, and during one of the wars between the Israelites and the Philistine, the Ark of Covenant was captured by the Philistine and taken to the temple of Dagon, the god who was half fish, half man. The next day, when the priests came to the temple, they saw that the sculpture of the god was broken and laid on the floor. They moved the Ark of Covenant to another temple, but then the same thing happened again and again. And when they tried to figure out what happened and went outside, they saw that people were contracting something called hemorrhoids. Now, hemorrhoids are not a plague, but when it happens to all the population, it's a cause for worry. In Peter van Halen's painting, which had a great influence on Poussin, you can see that the people in the streets are dying, but they're not covered with boils, and they don't seem to be sick, but they're just dead. And we will see two very interesting things. In the foreground of the painting, you will see a young dead woman. Her ivory-colored skin is very prominent in the painting, and a young child is advancing toward her, wanting to suckle milk from her breasts, which are exposed. The woman is dead, and when painters painted dead women with their children, they actually tried to tell us that not only the generation of the parents are about to die from a plague, but also the generation of the children who could not be fed. On the left-hand side, you will see young men very much influenced by paintings by Rubens. And you will see that indeed he does not look as if he's sick or suffering from any ailment. But this was the way that the Flemish painter Van Halen painted that disease. In the center of the print, showing us the plague in Rome in the 2nd century, you will see two figures. One is an angel and the other is a messenger of his. The messenger pounds on a door, and the number of pounds he's going to hit the door with is going to be the number of people who are going to die in this household. Pretty horrible. Now, that time in Rome, the 2nd century, was an interesting period because some people still believed in going to Asclepius, the god of medicine, the pagan god. And some asked the priests of Christ, the new religion, to try and help us. One way or another, we see the same situation repeating itself. The young woman clutching her breast, the young people dying in the street, and on top of everything, the sculpture of Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of that time. Pierret Duttielt was a Flemish illustrator. And the subject he depicted in the 14th century was a pretty gruesome one, and it involves us, the Jews. On the 14th of February, 1349, the people of Strasbourg, now in France, decided that the best way to fight the plague was to burn the Jews of the city. Now, when we think of the 14th of February, we always think of Valentine's Day. Obviously, we tend to look into the nice things about life. But the 14th of February was a horrible day for that community. Not only did they not poison the wells as they were accused, and not only did they have nothing to do with the plague, it was pretty much the way of those ancient Gothic cities to take their anger and their misery upon the Jews, and at the same time gain the property, the riches, the money, the jewelry, and everything that that community had. So what we're actually talking about is not just xenophobia, the fear of strangers, because these people were not strangers, they were part of the community, but the way that people took upon themselves to punish the communities who were less strong than them, less protected than them, and the Jews were again the victim. In a strange coincidence, the next artist we're about to talk about came from Strasbourg, and his name was Matthias Grauter. He moved to Italy and he worked with some popes as illustrator of illustrated manuscripts. And one of the books he illustrated was the Trionfi by Petrarca, the poet from the 14th century. Francesco Petrarca, very much like Cesare Ripa, whom I've mentioned before, tried to write a poem about major things in life, like love and death and happiness and tranquility. And one of the triumphs he talked about in his poems, written in the middle of the 14th century, was death. And in the illustrator Grauter made for the poem, he depicted the angel of death, or the skeleton as we know him, as one of the most prominent images of death, actually celebrating upon the death of Laura, the poet's beloved, whom we know from his poems about her. The death plucks a golden hair from Laura's head, and thus she dies. So the death is one of the major triumphs that man needs to know about and cannot ignore. And as you can see in the backdrop of the painting, very much like it will happen later on in the Iconologia book, another story is taking place, and that is of a funeral, where we see people carrying coffins to the burial grounds. Much more gruesome depiction of the triumph of death is the one by Peter Bruegel the Elder. The painting is now at the Prado Museum, and it's a horrible depiction of death all over a town or a village. We start with the backdrop of a sea, and in the sea ships are being burned. And as we go closer to the shore, we will see hanging columns, we see gallows, we see people being beheaded. And then we see death playing around, taking care of the dead, moving them from one place to another, cartloads of skeletons, of skulls. But take a look. It's a very grim painting, I admit, but we need to look at the lower point of the painting, at the right-hand corner. At the right-hand corner, we see a couple of lovers. They're sitting, they're playing music, and they're oblivious to the world beyond them. What does Bruegel try to tell us? Are they silly, or does love conquer all? One of the beliefs was that plagues come from above, from heaven, as arrows. What was the reason for that? Was it the story from the Greek mythology about Niobe, whose children were killed with arrows from the raging gods? Perhaps. Was it because people believed that plagues were something that chose God's wrath upon the people of the earth? Perhaps that was the reason. One way or another, in this very crude woodcut, hand-painted woodcut that you see now, there is a depiction of the plague in London. Again, the miasma plays a very major role because the Thames was very filthy. But it's not only that. As you can see, the angel of death is again in the center, very much like in the former image we saw. And we can also see that the people are dying around. So, arrows, remember them. We will see them again soon. In the last decade of the 19th century, cholera raged across Europe. The Swiss painter Arnold Böcklin tried to depict the story of the cholera in a very different way, not in his contemporary times, but in a medieval town where a bride and a young groom are dead, being mourned by the lady-in-waiting, the woman in the red dress, while other people in that narrow medieval street escape from a monster. The monster that carries on its back the angel of death is a part snake, part vampire, and part dragon. He symbolizes death, he symbolizes destruction, and while we don't see why there is cholera in the streets, we understand that something is terrible and it's taking its toll on the people. Remember this dragon. We're about to see him very soon. The Jewish artist Jacob Steinhardt came back from the war, First World War, to depict this horrible image of the plague, the Spanish flu. Of course, you can see James Ensor influence over the young Jewish painter who later came to live in Israel. But at that time, he was still living in Berlin and trying to understand what he saw as an army photographer. Take a look at the images. Take a look at the people in his work of art. They're not just sick, they're deranged. And this is the first time, I think, that in one of the images I've shown you, we can see how being sick can turn people crazy. They go out of their mind. They don't understand what's taking place. And it's not only the death toll, it's also the psychological effect of being sick with something that there's no cure from. Jacob Pins, who was also born in Germany but moved to Israel, was the painter and etcher and woodcut maker and collector, as we all know, of Japanese art, who depicted the apocalypse. He created it after World War II, and as you can see, he was well familiar with the work of Arnold Böcklin we previously saw. The image of the dragon, the image of that monster that spreads horror and typhus in this case, reappears in his work of art, showing us how people died in the camps, being not just hungry, but suffering from typhus. The very last image on this chapter is the Quilt Project, which took place in the United States in 1986 and onward. People whose beloved ones, friends, family, suffered and died from AIDS and had no possibility to mourn them properly, and some who did but also wanted to commemorate them in a different way, created the quilt. 50 tons of material were seen across the mall in Washington, D.C. As you can see, each square is not just a reminder of the young men or women who died during the AIDS plague of the 80s, but also a commemoration of folkloric art. And it brings to mind the fact that quilts are usually created for two happy occasions. One is the birth of a baby, and the other is marriage. And here, we kind of cover our dead, we depart from them, we say goodbye to them in a very tender way, commemorating who they are. The painting you're looking at is actually in the Israel Art Museum. It was a gift from Lila and Herman Schickman from New York to the American Friends of the Israel Museum. And it was done by a German painter called Hayes. Hayes depicted the story of the brazen serpent when the children of Israel were moving across the desert on their way to the country of Israel. As you can see, some of the images we've already met during the previous images reappear here. The dead woman with a baby next to her breast, the young men suffering, children dying, and the idea behind the brazen serpent, in this case the way to cure the children of Israel, was to touch that sculpture, part column, part idol, that Moses and Aaron erected in the desert, so whoever touches the serpent will be cured of the serpent's bite. A Roman copy of a sculpture of Athene Farnese, the Greek goddess of the city of Athens, was a commemoration to the disease that struck Athens during Pericles' time. Actually, Pericles died of it. The Athenians created the sculpture trying to thank the lady of the city, to thank their goddess for protecting the citizens and for trying to stop the plague. As you can see, in many stories that relate to the old times, people believe that divine intervention is needed. People themselves cannot fight the plagues. They cannot try to do something to stop them. Hygiene was not on a high level. Doctors didn't really know what to do. And in that case, people turned into saints, into gods, into all sorts of believable requisites so they can try to gain back their health and to continue with normal life. We've already seen the outcome of the bubonic plague, which raged across Europe in the 14th century. As we know it, it was the Black Plague. The Franciscans, headed by Saint Francis, the saint, were the ones who were ready to take care of the people who contracted the plague. They administrated their wounds. They gave them water to drink. They tried to ease their suffering and give them comfort through prayers and through encouragement. They were probably not the only monks who came to the aid of the suffering people. But in this particular illustration, we can see St. Francis and we can see the people who are trying to help those diseased. Saint Sebastian was an interesting saint, not only because he's always depicted as naked, tied to a column, and being shot with arrows, but mostly in the theological sense because he survived. He survived those arrows and lived to tell and die again. But you remember I told you about the arrows earlier on. People believe that Saint Sebastian is the best interventor for the sick people because having suffered the arrows and surviving them, he could go and plead for the people, like in this particular work, where you can see him in the sky going over to Christ and begging him to have mercy on the people of the city of Pavia during the plague. His body is filled with arrows, and he is on his knees begging for Christ's help. The people below show us the burial grounds, the people who are dying, the priests who have no way to help, they're absolutely helpless, and even one of the morticians is falling over himself with a new boil in his body. Dr. Schnabel, also known as Dr. Beek, was a doctor in Rome during the 17th century. It was not his real name, it was some kind of a title given to him because of his strange costume. The real one you can see on the other side of the painting. He used to walk the streets of Rome, and he was known as a fearful image because, as you can see in the print, the children ran away from him. He never actually touched the patients. What he had was a long rod in which he probed their ailments. This is not exactly the kind of doctor we would recommend today, but back then he was pretty famous. How do you fight cholera? The Americans in the late 19th century found a way. Soap. Carbolic soap. You needed to sanitize. You needed to do something about cleanliness in your home, in your body, especially your hands. And when a ship full of cholera patients reached the shores of New York, you can see how the little people try to fight back the cholera. And while, as you can see in this caricature done by an Austrian immigrant to America, it's not a very nice proclamation that this is not the kind of immigrant we want to receive into our shore, and the image of the death himself as somebody coming from the east, perhaps the north of Africa, perhaps Turkey, again shows us that xenophobia, or the fear of strangers, was not something that only happened in medieval Strasbourg. It also happened in 19th century New York. The people of St. Louis tried to fight back when the Spanish flu reached them. And as you can see, women, part of the Red Cross forces, were ambulance drivers, and when we look at the way they're dressed, it reminiscent the way we are dressed today, and I mean face masks. The cover of the face was eminent to fighting the war against the plague, and these women stand very strong in the photograph of an anonymous photographer from the very beginning of the plague in 1918. Our very last image for this presentation takes us to a Russian-born artist who lives in Venice Beach called Pony Wave. We don't know her real name. She wants to keep it undercover. And what you can see is that she's also a tattooist. She is a tattoo artist, and herself is perhaps the best example of her art. But when she took one of the Venice Beach walls, because museums and galleries were closed during the quarantine time, she depicted herself and a lover of hers kissing while donning on the masks. Remember the lovers in Peter Bruegel's Triumph of Death? There we didn't know if the lovers were simply stupid or oblivious to the world beyond them. Here we know what Pony Wave is trying to tell us. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of our presentation. Take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and I do hope to see you in Jerusalem, and very soon. Goodbye.
Precious name on